Okay guys, so in this first video of my little series about Express and learning the basics of how a server and a client works, we're just going to briefly touch on the setup and then we will get right into it. So what we're doing in this series is that we're going to walk through these episodes here, and I am running a Express server by simply having this little testing file here, which is basically just a jest setup that I'm using. So if I just run jest now, you're going to see that all of my little tests here are passing, and this is a basic jest test. We can actually go and look at my dependencies here, and we can see that my dev dependency is supertest, and then we have body parser and express. I have jest installed globally on my computer, but I could probably add it into the package JSON as well there. But anywho, so the goal of this series is to teach you the basics about how a server talks to a client. So what is a client? A client is anything that needs to talk over the internet, or well, not necessarily the internet, but in this scenario it's going to be the internet, using something like HTTP, the HTTP protocol, in order to communicate with the remote computer. So that is basically every single time you have used a phone app that uses the internet to get data or send data to some external remote server or something, that's you using HTTP. That's you using, well, not necessarily HTTP, but you are communicating. You have a server-client relationship. Your phone, the app, and the app that you use, that's the client. The server is the computer that is living somewhere on the internet that you're talking to, okay? And a client can also be the browser. If you're using a browser and you go to a web page, hey, that's your client, and the client is now talking to the server. So every time you go to google.com, for example, you have a browser which is the client, and the server is Google's computers that sends you the data and takes care of all the stuff that you want to do, right? So those are the basics of what a client-server relationship is, and this little test here is simulating that relationship. Now we want to be able to do what's called a integration test, and this is very common when you create your own web applications. You want to test that they work the way that they are supposed to be working. So the format of this video series is going to be this. We're going to walk through all of these different types of tests, and I will talk to you about the different things that you need to know in order to understand how a server and client works. Alright, so let's get into it. So in this first episode, we are going to do a small walkthrough of the absolute most basic network request that we can make, which is the GET request. What is the GET request? Well, the GET request is, to make this more clear, so HTTP, which is the communication protocol that we use for almost all web traffic, has a few so-called methods, and the most common method that you can use is the GET method. This is the method that whenever you visit a web page, whenever you get some type of, you download a web page to your application or so forth, or if you, almost every single application uses the GET method by default. It is the way that you communicate from the client to the server that, hey, I want some data. Now, this is not necessarily the way it has to be. There are other methods that still can get you data. This is just a convention so that we programmers can understand that, alright, it's a GET request, therefore we are going to go and get some data. There's nothing, it's just a practice. There are other, it's not like you're going to fail a network request unless you say that it's a GET method, but still, let's just leave it there for now. So here we are importing my application, which is this little server. We'll talk about that in just a moment. And then we have our test. So all we're going to do, this is like the most basic test that you can possibly write for a server. So what we're going to do is that we are going to make an async request. So in supertest, what you can do is that you can export your app, your Express app, and wrap it in the request function that comes from supertest. And so supertest is now going to spin up the server, run the query that we want, and then just make an expect. That's it. So all this test is doing is that it's spinning up the server and it's checking that there is a root URL. and then it expects 200 to be returned. And 200, we're going to cover this later. It's called a status code, and it's just a way for us to say for the server to tell the client what happened in the request. We'll talk about that in a later video. So the next test is, okay, it should return one foo. So here we go. We make a request, we get a response, and now we expect that the response body, which is the content that is now being returned to us from, like, a server doesn't have to return anything. A server can simply send back nothing, but in this scenario we have one test to just send back nothing and one request to send back a so-called body, a response body, which contains some data. In this case it's going to be JSON. So let's look at our fancy server after all of this docking. This is our entire server. It's nothing, basically. So here we grab Express, we instantiate our application, and then we say that app.get, which this is what's happening now. So we declare that if somebody tries to connect to our server on this path, then do this. And all we're going to do is do response.json and send back one foo, and then we export our application. So this is the absolute bare bone basics of how a server basically how a server says that, all right, if somebody tries to connect to me using the get method on this URL, I'm going to do this. And this is the client. That's the entire relationship. I hope this was useful to you. Have a great day.